Yeah, welcome back to ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. This is Global Connections. We're talking about strategic relations with Russia and comparing them to our current relationship with China, with Carl Baker, formerly Executive Director of Pacific Forum. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Thanks for having me, Jay. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
And I agree the same to be with you. But I tell you, I was looking at the news stories and the Times and elsewhere to get warmed up for this show, and I'm a little frightened. I think we're back to a Cold War. It seems to be accelerating every day. What do you think?
Well, we're certainly back to a hostile relationship with China. I hope I'm with Russia. I hope we're not back to the Cold War, because I think it's wrong to think about this as going back to the Cold War, because it's a new world, and a Cold War isn't going to work this time around. And so it's to our detriment if we try to portray this as a Cold War. I think that's first and foremost. But certainly there are a lot of unfortunate things that are happening in the U.S.-Russia relationship.
So, what do you think happened to the U.S.-Russia relationship in the course of the Trump administration? Because it was news all the time. That is Trump's strange relationship with Putin. Strange is the only word that comes to mind. Thus, the relationship, politically between Trump and Putin had, secondary effect, if you will. And I think a lot of people in this country, I'll never forget, there's a reporter that went to a gun show in the South and went around the room to all these Second Amendment people and said, "What do you think of our relationship with Russia?" And the answer, and it was a Trump answer, with most of them, if not all of them, and they were all politically Trump people, was, "Oh, we haven't been fair with Russia. We have to be nicer to Russia. Vladimir Putin is a great guy, and we have to warm up to him," which was Trump's song and dance too. And so I'm wondering, how things might have changed in terms of the American involvement, the American public's involvement, and for that matter, the government's involvement in relations with Russia during that 4-year period.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a big part of the problem with the Trump administration was that there was always this sense that Trump admired Putin for his strongness, for his rough demeanor, for his frontiersman-like attitude, out in the woods and those kinds of things. But I think first I want to say that the problems didn't start with Trump. I mean, the problem with Russia, I think, go back to the early 90s. But what I'll say about during the Trump era, I think there's three key things that happened. One is that we stopped talking about democracy promotion and human rights support in Russia and in the region in general. And second, I think Trump always encouraged support from Russia. He didn't obviously, with all the election interference and stuff, he never got to the point of saying, "Russia, you're involved and you're responsible for this." He always sort of encouraged that political support. And then third, he of course broke with the European allies. He didn't stick with the European allies, and instead, sort of became very confrontational with the EU over trade and NATO over defense procurement, or over defense spending by the European Union. So I think those are the three things really that sort of encouraged Putin's behavior and exacerbated a bigger problem that we've had with Russia. Because I think the real problem with Russia goes back to where we are today. And where we are today is that the only way we are going to really improve relations is either the United States continues to withhold support for democracy in the border regions of Russia and within Russia itself. Or second, Russia stops seeing democracy and liberalism in its region as a threat. And I think those two things are very unlikely to happen. So I think that's where we are today. And that's where the problem goes back when you look back into the early 1990s. When you look at what happened with NATO expansion, with the Kosovo War, the withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in 2002, the 2003 Iraq War, support for the color revolutions, all those things were seen by Russia as a threat. And we saw them as promoting democracy. So I think, that's where we are. That's where we are today. It's sort of an accumulation of all the things that we didn't do after the wall came down.
Yeah. Well, one thing I mentioned to you before the show, and I want to revisit that for a moment, is in my view, it's very ironic that during the Trump administration and in the elections of both, the 2016 and 2020, Trump was calling on Vladimir Putin for help, using the Internet Research Agency and other Russian intelligence organizations to hack into our systems and try to affect public opinion in this country in his favor for those two elections and other elections.
Mm-hmm.
And also Russia was doing things to divide the country as Trump was. So now in the paper today, Putin takes the position that he has the moral superiority, that he's the one that the world should look to for peace and security and harmony, because he has the moral superiority. The United States is in a decayed condition because it is divided. The very division that he was instrumental in creating, or at least exacerbating. It's very ironic that this would happen. And it suggests to me that Putin is into the big lie, lying about Navalny, lying about democracy, lying about Ukraine, and I don't know how many other things. And I don't know whether that's going to work in the long term, but right now he's got control of it, and he extended his presidential term to 2036. He's going to be pretty old in 2036.
Well, just as an aside on whether he's really going to hold out until 2036, there was an article by a Russian author, and the name, I don't remember the name, but he points out that in fact the Russian Constitution, it doesn't allow that. That while he's done this by executive order, there's actually some constitutional limitation to that happening. So we can always hold out hope that rule of law will come into play in Russian politics at some point. But I agree that Putin has always been the provocateur. He's always been somebody who wants to provoke at the margins, and I think he sees what's happening in the United States today as part of that opportunity. With Ukraine, obviously there was a lot going on in the Trump administration about support for Ukraine. Whether you support Ukraine or whether you support Russia. Oddly, for Americans, that almost became a dividing line in the context of what was happening with the Bidens and Ukraine and Trump and Russia. It sort of was playing out as a political drama in the United States that you either had to choose Ukraine or you had to choose Russia, which is rather odd. But on the idea that Putin is taking advantage of a demonstrable weakness in American democracy, I think he's taking the lead in some respects, from Xi Jin-ping, because Xi Jin-ping and the Chinese have been much more effective in how they've approached it, but they also have taken the line that authoritarianism is really good because it prevents things like decay that you see in the West, and specifically, over the past 4 years, what's happened in the United States.
Yeah. Well, what about Navalny? Navalny somehow represents a hope for a better future, and yet, I would predict Navalny will be dead in a week. And what happens when he dies? He has a movement behind him. They say that movement will go underground. It won't die, but query whether it'll have any real effect on Putin.
Well, dissidents in the past haven't fared well in Russia. So I agree that, Navalny it was rather odd that he decided to go back to Russia to take his stand. Honestly, Navalny, part of the attraction of Navalny is that he's a nationalist, and he's had ties to right wing, and so he's a sort of a populist. He's probably not the ideal candidate to really take the mantle and promote true democracy in Russia. But nonetheless, I think that Navalny does represent sort of that last ditch hope in Russia that there's somebody who can stand up to Putin. And I just don't see that happening. So will it go underground? Perhaps, but I don't. I worry that there's really not enough momentum inside Russia today to make somebody like Navalny last. That there isn't really a sustained attitude in Russia that they really can change the system. There's almost a sense of destiny that Russia is destined to be run by a czar sort of person like Putin, and that they're really that democracy has failed them. And part of that narrative that of course Putin is pushing is that democracy doesn't work. Democracy is not an answer to the problems. And so I think Putin is very effectively using the failures of the United States and other democracies in the West to promote that idea, and it's to some extent working inside Russia.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned czarist, czarist techniques, czarist concepts, because it seems like the whole affair of the Communist Party for 100 years has gone. It was only an intercession. And so you start out with a czarist dictator, and then you end with a czarist dictator. And all of the efforts to make a better system through communism seem to have passed into history.
Well, yeah, I mean, but don't forget, it's Stalinist and Leninist communism, and so I think that's where Putin comes in, is that he's taken his cues much more from the dictators Stalin and Lenin than he has from Marx as the idea of advancing society. So it's a very Leninist, it's a very Stalinist society. So those two individuals certainly have a lot of responsibility for how Putin has viewed his role as the leader of Russia.
Well, here's a country that has an economy the size of Michigan. It's not doing well economically. And here's a country, nevertheless, that has invested a lot of money, time, and education into nuclear weapons, which it still pretty much has. Here's a country where one of the military people was recently quoted as proud of this torpedo they have developed. I don't know if you saw that. A torpedo, it's a nuclear torpedo, and you aim it at a city, and it essentially makes the city radioactive without necessarily having a big explosion, and the city then becomes uninhabitable. This kind of weapon, and they're talking weapons. And the question I put to you is, how do you control a guy like Putin? How do you control this dictatorial, aggressive administration? And is Joe Biden doing a good job, doing the best he can?
Well, I mean, it's really early in the Biden administration to answer that question, I think. I mean, in the past, the United States has tried resets with Russia, and I don't think resets have worked. I mean, I think that when you look at the reset in the Obama administration, it was sort of a unsustainable kind of transaction that that the U.S. backed off support for Ukraine and Georgia entering NATO, and in exchange, Russia sort of pushed Iran on developing nuclear weapons and provided the access through Russian territory to resupply Afghanistan. And I don't think that was really very sustainable, And so, after by the end of the Obama administration, it was clear that was breaking down, with NATO involvement in Libya and the whole scenario with the Snowden asylum into Russia, and then the annexation of Crimea. That transactional approach that Obama tried to take with it wasn't really sustainable. So, what does Biden do? I mean, Biden has got to deal with arms control. It's got to deal with Iran, Afghanistan, climate change. Some of those things you need to have some interaction with Russia. You can't just ignore Biden. I mean, Biden can't just ignore Putin. So you've got to think about how you're going to deal with it. And I think the way you deal with Putin, who is ultimately a bully and ultimately somebody who's threatened by democracy, that you've got to establish some red lines. And the red line, maybe the red line starts with Navalny. What are you going to do with Navalny? And then it starts with, what do you do with those troops that you've massed on the border of Ukraine? And I think those are the kinds of things that Biden has to do. There's been a lot of criticism about Biden's call with Putin, that, on the one hand, he implemented sanctions, and then on the other hand, he said, I want to have a summit. But I think that's not ideal, but I think it's the start in the right direction. That sanctions are useful to an extent. I don't think they're going to work, but I think that at least it's a start in the direction to say, we're not going to try to reset. We're not going to just give you a clean slate. We're going to start with saying we disagree with what you're doing. And then I think the next step is that there has to be some red lines established, and red lines that mean red lines, not red lines that we say, well, this is different. So I think that's where Biden has to go. And it's a little bit unfair, after one phone call, to say, is Biden on the right track? I mean, there's some really difficult terrain ahead for Biden, and especially, given what's happening in eastern Ukraine right now, what's happening with Russian activity in Syria and other places in the Middle East. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, all those things. Russia has a play, because Russia has interests in that near abroad, and it's going to maintain those interests. And so I think it's very difficult for the United States to come down hard against Putin. It certainly has to have support from Europe. And right now, one of the areas that there's a possible sanction is on Nord Stream 2. But then you have the Germans who say, "Whoa, let's wait a minute. We don't want to just give away all that gas and pay more money to the Americans and Ukrainians to get that resource. We'd really like that gas to come in from Russia." So so there's conflicting interests in the European Union that the United States needs to recognize also. So so it's very difficult, I think, to find the right tenor between, we need to cooperate on some things, and we really need to hold the whole line on other things.
It sounds like a really complex chess game where you make moves, you wait for the other guy, make more moves. There are so many pieces on the board, so many strategies in your pocket, and I think we'll have to watch it going forward, because the consequences could be really, really bad. If I could ask you to look at both sides of the consequences, what's a good result here, and what's a bad one?
I think the good result is that we maintain the borders in Eastern Europe as they are, without any further incursions in the region. We somehow neutralize Russian influence in the Middle East, and specifically in Syria, and maybe ultimately Afghanistan. We have good competition between China and Russia in Central Asia, and the United States and Russia are able to develop some mechanism to sustain arms control. And arms control, we've extended the New START for 5 years, but we also need to think about what we're going to do with intermediate range missiles, what we're going to do with hypersonics, what we're going to do with space weapons. And I think that a good solution is to come up with some mechanism to govern those kinds of weapons also.
Oh,
A big task.
yeah, this is an all-day job. There's a piece of the paper about how both Russia and China, we should talk about China too, are advancing their nuclear arsenals much faster than the U.S. Not only in the number of weapons, but in the technology.
Yeah.
And so this is a problem. At the same time, Carl, and this worries me, is that the U.S. ain't what it was in terms of the view of foreign nations. I mean, you talk about the EU and whether it has full respect or as much respect for us as it did, say, 10 years ago. I'm really wondering about that, because I think it's been damaged we turned our backs on them for 4 years and query whether they feel the same way about our leadership today and our influence on these issues. And then if you look at the US today, just look at the headlines every day. There's all these divisive things happening. We aren't what we were. We're not as together. And so Biden has to look at both of these things, knowing that, at least in looking at Russia, they see our decay, if you will, as a function of what's going on the front page every day. So query, do we have the same level of negotiating power that we had before?
And I think, as I said at the start, no. And that's why you can't go back to a Cold War. That's why you can't go back to containment and full-time confrontation with Russia, and certainly not with China, because we don't have that credibility anymore. We don't have the ability to act unitarily. We can't do that. The unitary moment from the 90s is gone, and it's not coming back. And yes, the Trump administration certainly did a lot to damage that, not only in Europe but also in Asia. There's a lot of concern about what the United States is going to do in Southeast Asia. Japan and South Korea are more willing allies yet, but I'm certain also that the South Koreans have been damaged by what's happened with the Trump administration, and that's not going to change. That's not going to come back. And so, yeah, I think we need to really think long and hard about this mindset that started in the Trump administration. It didn't start in the Trump administration, but it was certainly fully articulated in the Trump administration about there's this emerging ideological contest between the democracies and the authoritarian regimes, and there's some sort of ideological divide that groups China and Russia together against the United States and the coalition of the willing, if you will, allies and partners that the United States talks about as promoting free and open Indo-Pacific, or talking about democracies and liberal order and all that. I think that there's a real risk in thinking like the United States that we can deal with China and Russia in the same way, because they're different powers and they have different centers of focus. And so I think that the United States really needs to be careful not to act unitarily, and second, not to promote this idea that Russia and China are authoritarian regimes that think alike and that are going to act together. And I think what we really need to do is think about how we take our strengths and work against the Chinese versus the Russians. And they're different entities, and they need to be treated in a different way. And they're approaching things from a different way. The Russians are always going to be provocative, especially with Putin in charge. They're always going to be provocative. They're always going to be the chess player trying to find that tactical opening. Where the Chinese, I have to forgive me, but the Chinese are Go players or Wei Qi players. They don't come in with that frontal attack on the center of the board. They go out to the edges and they look around the edges and they try to build that coalition around themselves. And that's what Belt and Road is. That's what the AIIB is. And that's what all these Silk Roads are from China. They're building this broad mechanism that allows them to capture multilateral organizations. Russia doesn't do that. Russia is much more bilateral in its approaches, and it's much more provocative. And it's willing to sacrifice in win-lose kinds of situations, where the Chinese talk about win-win, whether they mean it or not. They talk about that, and that's what they're selling themselves as. And so they're trying to promote themselves as governors of the multilateral organizations. They're saying, yeah, we like multilateral organizations. Russia likes multilateral organizations only to the extent that they have veto power in it. And so both of them say, we like the UN. The Chinese like the UN because they figured out that they can actually influence by putting people in key positions in the UN. Russia likes the UN because it has veto power and it can promote its national interests through a multilateral organization. And I think that's a big difference. That if you think about Russia as the chess player and China as the Go player, you really need different strategies to approach these two countries. And to not do that, I think, and to sort of push them all into a single camp of authoritarian regimes is a mistake. It's easy and it's comfortable and it's easy to sell to the American public. But you really need to be careful when you think about how you deal with each one, because if you push them together, as we've done to some extent, you start seeing this military cooperation. Personally, I think the military cooperation between Russia and China is largely done by Russia because it sees it as much more important than the Chinese do. The Chinese are always going to be more interested in economic engagement and influence through trade agreements and through their Belt and Road initiatives that give them access to foreign resources, but also gives them an outlet for excess labor and excess capacity.
And you spoke about the difference in the way Russia, or at least Putin, sees the government as relating to Western democracies versus the way Xi Jinping sees the government of China as relating to Western democracy. And my impression is that from our discussion is that China sees its system as superior than American democracy, and he's able to get things done that we can't do. It's very pragmatic,
Yeah,
and and it works.
yeah, I mean, if you listen to Xi Jinping's speech at Bao Forum this week, that's what it was all about. It was about the superiority of the system, and that they're not really threatened by democracy because they're selling themselves as having a system superior to it. We promise you, you can do what you want inside your country. We don't care. We won't upset anything you're doing inside your country. But if you cross us in condemning the killing of the Uyghurs or the genocide of the Uyghurs, or if you try to say Taiwan is an independent country, we're going to come after you. But do what you want inside your country, and so that's very attractive to a lot of dictators in this world, a lot of people in Southeast Asia who are nominally elected but very much authoritarian inclined. And the same in the Middle East, the same in Africa, where these leaders of these countries are saying, yeah, I think China's onto something here. They do have soft power. That their system does work. And look at how fast China has developed. And so China, yeah, comes across as saying we aren't threatened by democracy. We're far superior to democracy. Putin, as I said, is still very threatened by democracy.
Yeah.
It
Well,
it sees the color revolutions and what's happening in Eastern Europe as much more of a threat. And part of it is I think the history, the reliance on Stalin and Lenin as the guiding lights for their political development, where Xi Jinping is much more of an emperor of China that sees his 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 development of his government as beneficial, as win-win. And so he always talks about win-win. Putin always talks about where can I get the tactical advantage? It's all about win-lose. It's all zero sum for Russia and
mm.
Putin.
So President Joe Biden has taken affirmative steps to deal with problems that surfaced at least in the public conversation during the Trump administration with Russia. But query, what steps has he taken? What steps should he be taking in dealing with China? Perhaps less aggressive?
Well, I mean, I think so far Biden has said, the current order is defined by the coalition of democracies, and so he's taken that line, that it is tending toward a cold war, that there's authoritarian versus democracy, and he does recognize, I think, that the economic aspects are win-win. I don't think he's done enough in terms of trade agreements yet or anything like that. I think that's too early, but I think eventually he will look at trade as something that is beneficial to the United States. And I think he also has focused a lot on sort of recapturing the friends and allies. And so he spends a lot of time trying to rebuild those relationships that Trump destroyed. And finally, Trump, Biden also has the notion that United States leadership is indispensable. that's still something that's there. That's a holdover from past democratic and past administrations in the United States. That's something that the Americans are going to have to learn at some point. And we talk about it, but it's very difficult for leaders of the United States to say we really don't need the military that can kill everybody a couple hundred times. We really don't need the military that can go and promote democracy in Iraq, or we really don't need a military that's going to be able to control, the entire wet surface of the earth. And so that hasn't happened yet. Biden isn't there, and I don't think the Americans are going to be there for a long time, for a couple decades at least. And so, I think that what Biden needs to do is it needs to at home, it needs to think about how do you counter Russian influence at home? How do you deal with their cyber activity? How do you deal with their political influence? You need to start thinking about limiting Russian access to U.S. money, and you do that by sanctioning the oligarchs. One of the things that one of the criticisms of the most recent Biden sanctions is, of course, that they sanctioned this direct markets for Russian money. But what they didn't do is they didn't do anything with the secondary market. So the American companies can still go in and buy secondary debt through the markets. And the other thing they didn't do is they didn't sanction any of the oligarchs. And so the oligarchs are still laundering money through the United States system. And so I think that's what he has to do at home. And then abroad, you really need to think about working through NATO, and you need to have some consensus in NATO. You can't say NATO, and by NATO you mean everybody follow the US. I think you really have to recognize that NATO is becoming much more multilateral, and then the EU also is something that you need to deal with. You can't say you have to follow US lead through NATO leadership. And I think the other thing is you need to demonstrate that you really do support democracies in the non-NATO countries also, specifically Ukraine and Georgia, and for that matter, Moldova. I think that you really need to protect that border region of Central and Eastern Europe. And then I think of course, you still need to deal with the arms control. And so I think that's the area that you need to work bilaterally. That you actually need to work with Russians bilaterally, and then climate change also.
Yeah, well, climate change is the number one priority at the end of the day. So you could probably get people to agree to that when it gets worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, yeah, but what does that really mean? I don't know. I mean, everybody recognizes climate change. You have to deal with it, and then the question is how do you deal with it?
Yeah, sure.
And whether we're really successful in that or not, I think is an open question, because it's just very difficult. I mean, just like with John Kerry's visit to China, China says, yeah, we agree. We need to work hard on climate change. But what are you going to do with all those coal-fired plants that you have built that are a cornerstone to your economy? Are you really going to let them go? Are you really going to go to renewables? On the other hand, China is developing nuclear power, and so maybe they're willing to let those coal-fired plants go, but they certainly have put a lot of money into them, and they say big countries should act like big countries. That's one of the things that came out of the Boao Forum. Is Xi Jinping said big countries should act like big countries and take leadership. United States, he's always ready. He's always ready to offer up United States as being you should go first. And so it's always that's always been the dilemma with collective action, of course, on the international scene. Is that okay? We all agree now. Who's going to move first? Yeah.
What I get out of this, Carl, is that we're in a new time. Just as you said at the inception of this discussion, we're in a new time, and maybe we're not as influential as we want to be or we used to be. And we have to, define a new role for ourselves, both East and West, and East and West combined. There's really three things. There's Russia, there's China, and then there's Russia and China. And
that's right.
And I think it's very important for us to be to understand that we really are in a new place. and we have to see ourselves in a new place, and we can't deal on the old American exceptionalism anymore.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing. It's going to be a hard thing for Americans to do because the tendency is always we need to show leadership. We need to, that's been the mantra for well since 1945. And as these countries move away from the idea that everybody is going to become a liberal democracy and have open markets is a hard thing to see go away, and it's hard to accept that's how the world is going to change. And so you really need to think we need to go back and start thinking about collective action, about how do you really implement collective action in an anarchical system where there is no single hegemony that can actually drive the agenda. And it's a very difficult problem.
Yeah, biblical in scope, biblical in depth. Well, thank you, Carl Baker. Always really enjoy these discussions. I hope we can do this again. Thank you
Yep.
so much, Carl.
Thanks, Jay.
Aloha.